It's been a while since my last video was uploaded. I hope you like something different for this that I've been working on. Hope you enjoy it. Final Fantasy VII is often hailed as one of the greatest video games of the fifth generation, with classics like Metal Gear Solid, Panzer Dragoon Saga, Resident Evil 2, Nights into Dreams, Super Mario 64, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. When it was released in 1997 for the PlayStation, it changed how people viewed the JRPG genre in the mainstream outside of Japan, with other games like Dragon Quest VII, Star Ocean: The Second Story, Persona 1 and 2, Xenogears, etc., as there are so many games for the PlayStation 1 alone. However, the PlayStation wasn't the only console that came out in that generation. Of course, we have the Nintendo 64, but one of the downsides to it was that it used cartridges instead of CD-ROMs, and Nintendo's treatment with third-party developers throughout the SNES and NES era. There was also the 3DO, the console that came out in 1993. While it was more powerful than its 16-bit consoles, it never took off due to external and internal events within the company and its partners. There also was the Atari Jaguar, another cartridge-based system, but it failed due to not even being a 64-bit and more like a weaker PlayStation and a better Super Nintendo. That's not to say all of these consoles are bad, but when you look at the larger picture, most gamers would talk about the PlayStation and Nintendo 64 as the generations mainstream, with each console having pros and cons of their genres. However, before Nintendo released their 64-bit console, there was another player that was well known for releasing arcade games, even outselling the Nintendo 64 in Japan, but wasn't able to generate the same success that the PlayStation would bring, and Final Fantasy VII would be the last nail in the coffin of many years of mistakes and divisions between two factions of the company, and not seeing the growing RPGs in the West following the success of Final Fantasy VII. The question in my mind right now is this: what if Final Fantasy VII had been released for the Sega Saturn? To answer the question, we need to understand why Final Fantasy VII wasn't released for the Sega Saturn. Because in our timeline, the first thing being that the Sega Saturn in 1997 wasn't selling all too well in the West. Keep in mind that in Japan, the PlayStation was starting to outsell the Saturn after the release of Final Fantasy VII, which would play into the downfall of the Saturn, along with the Saturn not having 3D games that captured gamers and the general public into buying the Saturn, as their flagship game Sonic Extreme was being cancelled. Another reason why the game didn't come out on the Saturn was because Sony published the game in the West and made it exclusive to the PlayStation, with the PC version of the game coming after the release of the PlayStation version just a year after it came out, in which by that point the Saturn was already being discontinued in North America and Europe. And the final factor was 3D games being more difficult to make than the PlayStation or Nintendo 64, as the hardware made it impossible for third party developers to make games on. And had they learned it by 1997, the market would have already told them that it was a failure. We also have to understand is that the Sega Saturn and how it was made, why the internet and YouTubers have said it was a 2D console, when in reality it was always a 3D machine, but the problem was how the games were made for it, given that 3D was new technology for a home system. Not as a secondary or add-on, it would be a hard time to make games that developers used to make on 16-bit systems and into an environment that a few had understand. It also had the same effect on other consoles besides the Saturn, with each having different hardware to make 3D games, which were difficult to make games in that generation, in which by the end of the PlayStation and Nintendo 64 were showing us graphics that weren't possible in 1995. So if we wanted to release Final Fantasy VII for the Saturn, we have to first understand how the Saturn works compared to the PlayStation. And even then, it would have been very difficult to develop on, given that the 3D capabilities were much more advanced compared to the PlayStation, but had different instructions on how to make it. Let's say that had Final Fantasy VII been released for the Saturn, sales would have gone up, even impressing reviewers. But even then, if it had come out, the writing was already in the wall. The Saturn was a failure by 1997, and even if the game had came out, it wouldn't have changed much for the Saturn. Sure, it would have proved reviewers wrong about the Saturn, and it was capable of 3D right out of the box, but it wouldn't change the point on how much of a failure the console was by that point. Even if it had come out first, it really wouldn't have changed that much. like Grania, which was released on the Saturn first, but didn't come out in the West until the PlayStation version of the game did a few years later, in which by that point most gamers were already playing on 6th generation consoles like the Dreamcast and the upcoming PlayStation 2. Even if Final Fantasy VII had come out first or later during the Saturn's lifespan, the game would have only been in Japan, which would have caused people to wonder in this alternate timeline if the Saturn version would have been better or worse than the PlayStation version. With gamers wondering if Final Fantasy VII had been worth it to make on the Saturn for a console that nobody bought outside of Japan and would have resulted in losses for this version of the game and would have been overshadowed by the PlayStation version of the game had it come out outside of Japan. But this is the scope beyond the video. So what is the point of doing this video? Because I wanted to try something new and different compared to my usual videos, to give people ideas on alternate history for video games. Because for me, it's something that I wanted to do when I first started writing down on my what ifs for my videos. Because for me, it's just something I'm passionate, and if it's successful, I would like to do more of them and become better at it. Until then, I hope you all liked the video, and until next time, bye.